poor black waitress helped an old man in the rain. But what followed the next morning shattered her world. Susan Schill walked into work exhausted and 10 minutes late, only to be fired in front of a packed diner that fell silent. She had no idea the stranger she'd sheltered that night was watching, too. And the moment he stepped through that door, every cruel word Steve Harlow said would echo back to destroy him. Before we go any further, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button. Your support means the world to us and helps us bring you even more powerful stories like this one. Now let's begin. The storm was relentless that night, slamming against the windshield like it wanted to push her off the road. Susan Schill gripped the steering wheel of her old white pickup, wipers scraping hard just to keep a glimpse of the street ahead. The diner had closed late, and she was dead tired, her gray uniform still damp from a spilled pot of coffee hours earlier. All she wanted was warmth and silence. Then she saw it. A black luxury sedan parked crooked on the roadside. Hazard lights blinking weakly through the downpour. The hood was up, steam rising in thin, desperate curls. As she slowed, her headlights caught the outline of an elderly white man standing beside the car, coat drenched, one hand on the fender for balance. A leather briefcase sat on the wet pavement beside him. No umbrella, no help, just a soaked suit and a tired face staring into the rain. She hesitated. It was late, the kind of night that taught people to mind their business. But she saw the way his shoulders shook, how his fingers struggled to hold the phone that clearly had no signal out here. Susan sighed, pulled over, and rolled down her window halfway. The smell of wet asphalt and engine oil filled the cab. "You okay out here?" she called. Her voice cut through the storm. The man turned, startled, squinting through the rain. "My car is dead. No tow trucks answering. I think I took a wrong turn." Susan reached over, unlocked the passenger door, and leaned toward the window. "You'll freeze out here. Get in before you drown." He hesitated, studying her. A stranger offering help on an empty road. Then he nodded, opened the door, and slid in, dripping water onto the worn seat. The briefcase landed at his feet with a heavy thud. He introduced himself as Robert Smith. Said he'd been driving back from a late meeting outside the city. The storm had caught him halfway, and his car gave up soon after. Susan listened but didn't pry. She just drove, the headlights sweeping over wet trees, the rhythm of rain steady and heavy on the roof. The wipers kept their tired beat, back and forth, carving brief windows of clarity before the rain swallowed the view again. Robert shifted in his seat, water pooling beneath him on the floorboard. "I tried 3 different tow services. None of them would come out this far in weather like this." "Can't blame them," Susan said, her voice soft. "Roads are dangerous tonight. Yet here you are." She glanced at him briefly, then back to the road. "Here I am." They passed a gas station, its lights flickering weakly in the distance. Then nothing but darkness and rain again. The kind of emptiness that made the night feel endless. "Do you live nearby?" he asked. "Not far. Few more miles." She paused, then added, "You can wait out the storm there. Use the phone if you need to. Call someone. I don't want to impose." "You already are," she said, but there was no edge to it. Just exhaustion and a hint of something softer. "Might as well make it worth the trouble." Another faint smile crossed his face. He pulled the briefcase closer, protective, like it held something precious. Then he leaned back against the seat and closed his eyes, letting the rhythm of the rain and the truck's rattling engine lull him into something close to rest. Susan drove on, her hands steady on the wheel, her mind already counting the hours until her next shift. She didn't know his name meant anything. Didn't know the briefcase held contracts worth more than she'd earn in a decade. Didn't know that in less than 12 hours, this act of kindness would cost her everything. She just knew someone needed help, and she couldn't drive past that. She took him to her neighborhood, a line of narrow apartment blocks, shadowed by flickering street lights. The paint peeled in long strips from the building fronts, and trash cans lined the curbs like tired sentries. It wasn't much, but it was home. Susan parked the truck in front of the third building, its number barely visible beneath years of grime and weather. "It's not fancy," she said, turning off the engine. The sudden silence felt strange after the storm's constant roar. "I wasn't expecting fancy," Robert replied, clutching his briefcase as he stepped out into the drizzle. They hurried up the concrete steps, past a broken light fixture that buzzed but gave no glow. Susan unlocked the door to apartment 2C and pushed it open. The space was small, almost claustrophobic. A couch that doubled as her bed, a kitchenette with a hot plate, a tiny bathroom behind a half-open door. But it was clean, painfully, meticulously clean. "Sit," she said, nodding toward the couch. "I'll get you something dry." She handed him a thin towel, frayed at the edges but freshly washed, and disappeared into the bathroom. A moment later, she returned with a steaming cup of instant soup, the kind that came in packets for 79 cents. "It's not much," she said again, placing it in his hands. Robert wrapped his fingers around the cup, savoring the warmth. "It's perfect." The radiator in the corner clicked and hissed, struggling to push heat into the cold room. Susan glanced at it, then at Robert, who was still shivering despite the towel draped over his shoulders. Without a word, she opened the narrow closet and pulled out a faded quilt, soft blue with white stitching along the edges, patches of fabric lovingly sewn together by hands that had known hard work and harder times. "Here," she said, holding it out. Robert looked up, hesitant. "That's yours." "I can't." "You can," she interrupted, her voice firm but gentle. "And you will. It's the only one I've got. But I'll be fine." "Susan, please." She pressed the quilt into his hands. "Just take it." He stared at her for a long moment, something unreadable passing across his face. Then he nodded, wrapping the quilt around himself. The weight of it seemed to ease something in his shoulders, and he sank back into the couch with a long, slow exhale. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Don't mention it." Susan pulled the single wooden chair from the kitchenette and positioned it by the window. She sat down, knees drawn up slightly, and watched the rain outside. It had slowed now, no longer the violent downpour that had hammered her windshield, but a steady, gentle drizzle that tapped softly against the glass. Behind her, Robert's breathing deepened, evening out into the rhythm of sleep. The briefcase rested on the floor beside him, forgotten for now. Susan's reflection stared back at her from the dark window, exhausted, worn, but somehow peaceful. Her uniform still smelled like burnt coffee and grease. Her feet ached. Tomorrow would come too soon, and she'd have to do it all over again. But tonight, in this small, cracked apartment with its flickering streetlights and hissing radiator, she had done the right thing. And that was enough. She leaned her head against the cool glass and closed her eyes, letting the rain sing her toward a few stolen hours of rest. Before dawn, she left for work. The apartment was silent except for the radiator's weak hiss. Susan moved quietly, careful not to wake her guest as she gathered her things. Keys, coat, the name tag she'd forgotten to take off the night before. But when she glanced at the couch, it was empty. The quilt lay folded neatly at one end, corners precise, almost military in their straightness. And resting on top of it, weighted down by her chipped coffee mug, was a small piece of paper. Susan picked it up, tilting it toward the gray light filtering through the window. Asterisk, "Thank you for seeing me as a person." Asterisk. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. She read it twice, then smiled faintly and folded the note into her uniform pocket. Something about those words settled warm in her chest, a counterweight to the exhaustion that never really left. She stepped back into the gray morning. The streets were slick, puddles reflecting the dull sky. The air was sharp and clean, scrubbed raw by the storm. Her breath misted in front of her as she walked to her truck, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then fell silent. She didn't know yet that the man she'd helped would walk into her life again. and that his next visit would change everything. The morning dragged in gray and cold. Susan's shoes squeaked on the diner floor as she rushed through the door 10 minutes behind. Her hair was still damp, her breath quick from the sprint up the hill. The smell of frying bacon and cheap coffee hit her like a wall. Behind the counter, Steve Harlow was already barking orders. His sleeves rolled, voice loud enough for the customers to hear. "Sheil, you think time bends for you?" His tone dripped contempt. Susan caught her breath, eyes lowered. "I'm sorry, sir." "My! Save it," he snapped, slamming a receipt pad on the counter. "We've got a packed morning. The owner's visiting, and you stroll in like you're doing us a favor." A few customers turned their heads. The young cook froze over the grill. The clatter of dishes quieted. The tension in the room was thick enough to taste. Susan tried again. Gentle, calm. "I had to help someone. An older man broke down in the storm. I couldn't just—" Steve cut her off with a wave. "You think good deeds pay rent? You're late. That's all that matters." He turned to the crowd, voice rising. "If any of you want to show up late, too, maybe you can join her out the door." A few people chuckled under their breath. Others looked away. Susan's chest tightened. "Please, Mr. Harlow. I've worked here 4 years. You know I don't." He pointed to the door. "You're done. Hand over your apron. I don't need excuses. I need reliability." Silence. Even the fryer seemed to stop bubbling. Susan untied her apron, hands trembling, jaw tight. She laid it carefully on the counter, refusing to let him see her break. The name tag caught the fluorescent light for a moment. Susaness. Before she set it down beside the apron. As she turned toward the door, a woman in a booth whispered to her friend, "That poor thing. She's the nicest one here." Susan walked out into the drizzle. The bell above the door jingling one last time. The rain was softer now, but it stung worse than last night. She pulled her coat tighter and kept walking, her shoes splashing through shallow puddles, the note still folded in her pocket like a small, useless shield against the cold. 5 minutes later, the bell above the door chimed again. Susan stepped inside, still in her wrinkled uniform, confusion etched on her face. She'd been halfway down the block when the cook had caught up to her, breathless, saying Mr. Smith wanted to see her. Now, urgent. Every head turned as she walked in, unsure why she'd been summoned back to the place that had just cast her out. The air felt different now, charged, electric. Steve stood rigid behind the counter, his face the color of old dishwater. And there, in the center of the diner like he owned the place because he did, stood Robert Smith. His eyes softened when he saw her. "Miss Sheil," he said, voice steady but warm. The room fell into a silence so complete that the hum of the refrigerator sounded like thunder. Susan stopped a few feet from him, her hands trembling at her sides. She didn't understand, couldn't piece it together. This was the man from last night, the stranger, the one she'd— "You helped me last night when no one else would," Smith continued. "You didn't know who I was, and you didn't care. You just—" The staff whispered in the kitchen, voices low and urgent. No one had ever met the elusive owner. For years, he'd been a name on paychecks, a signature on memos, a presence felt but never seen. And today was the day. Steve checked his watch, then checked it again 30 seconds later. At exactly 12:30, the door opened. The bell chimed once. A tall, silver-haired man stepped inside, dressed in a dark tailored coat, polished shoes, and composure that quieted the whole room. His presence was calm but commanding, the kind that made people stand straighter without knowing why. He moved with the ease of someone who'd spent a lifetime walking into rooms and owning them. The cook paused mid-turn at the grill, spatula suspended in air. A waitress froze with a coffee pot half raised, staring. Steve hurried forward with a salesman's smile plastered on his face. "Mr. Smith." "Welcome, sir," Steve said, voice high with forced warmth. He extended his hand like he was presenting a gift. "Everything's running perfectly. Clean, efficient, just like you'd want it. Robert Smith shook his hand briefly, then let it drop. His eyes scanned the diner. The booths, the counter, the polished chrome, the staff trying not to stare. His gaze lingered on the empty corner near the window, the station where Susan usually worked. A coffee pot sat unused. An order pad lay untouched. His jaw tightened slightly. "Where's the young woman from last night?" he asked, voice even. Steve blinked. "I'm sorry, sir?" "Susan Shield," Smith said again, enunciating each syllable carefully. "The waitress who worked here yesterday morning." The manager forced a laugh, waving his hand dismissively. "Oh, her. I had to let her go. I'm afraid. Always late. Poor attitude. Not the kind of image you'd want for your business, sir." Smith's expression didn't change, but the silence that followed cut through the chatter like a blade. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks stopped moving. He turned toward the cook, who'd gone very still at the grill. "Is that true?" The cook looked at his shoes, then at Steve, then back at his shoes. "No, sir," he said quietly. "Susan was the best we had." Steve's smile faltered. "People like to exaggerate, Mr. Smith. I run a tight ship here. Standards matter." Smith stepped closer, closing the distance between them. When he spoke, his voice was soft but carried the weight of stone. "You fired her this morning?" "Yes, sir. For cause." Smith nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Steve's face. The manager shifted his weight, suddenly uncertain. Then Smith said, "Call her back." Immediately, the color drained from Steve's face. "Sir, that won't be necessary." I said call her back," Smith repeated. The room went dead quiet. Even the coffee maker seemed to hold its breath. 5 minutes later, the bell above the door chimed again. Susan stepped inside, still in her wrinkled uniform, confusion etched on her face. She'd been halfway down the block when the cook had caught up to her, breathless, saying Mr. Smith wanted to see her. Now, urgent. Every head turned as she walked in, unsure why she'd been summoned back to the place that had just cast her out. The air felt different now, charged, electric. Steve stood rigid behind the counter, his face the color of old dishwater. And there, in the center of the diner like he owned the place because he did, stood Robert Smith. Smith's eyes softened when he saw her. "Miss Shield," he said, voice steady but warm. The room fell into a silence so complete that the hum of the refrigerator sounded like thunder. Susan stopped a few feet from him, her hands trembling at her sides. She didn't understand, couldn't piece it together. This was the man from last night, the stranger, the one she'd. "You helped me last night when no one else would," Smith continued. "You didn't know who I was, and you didn't care. You just saw a person who needed help." Whispers rippled through the diner like wind through wheat. The cook dropped his spatula, and it clattered against the grill. The waitress near the coffee station gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Smith turned slightly, addressing the room now. "This woman gave me shelter in a storm. She shared the only food she had. She gave me her only blanket and slept in a chair so I could rest." His voice carried weight, authority, the kind that made people listen whether they wanted to or not. "She showed me what this place should represent." He turned back to Susan, and something in his expression shifted, became almost gentle. "So I'm making it official. Susan Shield is reinstated as co-manager. Effective immediately." The words hung in the air like something physical. Steve's jaw fell open. "You can't be serious. She's unreliable, she." "I'm very serious," Smith interrupted, his tone cooling several degrees. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You wanted to impress me, Mr. Harlow. Congratulations. You just did the wrong way." The color drained completely from Steve's face. Smith continued, his gaze unwavering. "You humiliated a loyal employee in front of customers. You dismissed compassion as weakness. You made a spectacle of cruelty on the very day I came to see how this business runs. He paused. Now I know. The staff began to clap, quietly at first hesitant, then building. Relief flooded the room like water breaking through a dam. The young cook grinned. The waitress wiped her eyes. Even a few customers joined in, uncertain what exactly had happened but sensing something right in it. Susan stood speechless, tears brimming and threatening to spill. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Smith smiled faintly, and for just a moment, she saw the tired man from the rain again, the one who'd sat in her tiny apartment and drunk cheap soup like it was fine dining. You gave me kindness in the rain, he said quietly, just for her. I intend to return it with respect. The bell above the door jingled again as customers walked in, brushing rain from their coats, unaware they were stepping into a diner that had just changed forever. Chapter 7. Weeks later, the diner was alive again. The mornings buzzed with regulars. The coffee flowed. Steve Harlow's smile had gone hollow. He worked the register now, relegated to counting change and processing orders. No longer the boss, just another employee answering to the woman he once humiliated. Each time she passed by, polite and unbothered, offering a thank you or a gentle good work, something darker grew behind his calm expression. He stayed late, after hours, pacing the kitchen while the night crew cleaned, muttering to himself, reorganizing things that didn't need reorganizing, his movements tight and angry. The cook noticed. The waitresses whispered, but no one said anything. Then came the missing cash. At first it was small, $50 here, $70 there. Susan caught it during a late-night count, her fingers moving quickly over the bills as she reconciled the day's receipts. The numbers didn't match. She checked twice, then 3 times, running through every transaction in her head. No mistakes on her end. She stared at the register drawer, her stomach sinking. The next week it happened again. $80. Then $60. Always from her register. Always on nights she closed. She didn't accuse anyone, but the worry settled deep in her gut like a stone. She started coming in earlier, staying later, double-checking everything. But the pattern continued. When it happened a 4th time, she went straight to Smith. He was in his office reviewing supplier contracts when she knocked. He looked up, saw her face, and immediately set down his pen. What's wrong? Susan closed the door behind her and sat down, her hands folded tightly in her lap. I've balanced every register myself, she said, her voice steady but strained. Down to the penny. The discrepancies aren't mistakes. It's deliberate. Someone's trying to make it look like I'm stealing. Smith leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. How much? Over $300 in the last month. Always from my drawer. Always on nights I'm closing. He studied her face. The exhaustion around her eyes, the tension in her jaw. Do you have any guesses? Susan hesitated. She had more than guesses. She had instincts honed over 4 years of watching Steve operate, of seeing how he moved through the world, of knowing exactly what he was capable of when his pride was wounded. But instincts weren't proof. None I can prove, she said finally. Smith nodded slowly. He didn't ask if she was sure about the numbers, didn't question her competence. He simply stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the diner floor where the evening shift was starting to trickle in. Then we'll find proof, he said quietly. He turned back to her, and something in his expression had shifted, hardened into the same resolve she'd seen the day he'd reinstated her. Leave it to me. Chapter 8. That evening, hidden cameras were installed near the counters. Smith brought in a quiet man in plain clothes, a private investigator with tired eyes and a leather notebook. He worked quickly, efficiently, mounting tiny lenses in the corners where shadows gathered. No one in the diner knew except him and Susan. Days passed. Susan worked as usual, smiling through the unease, pouring coffee with steady hands even as her heart hammered in her chest. Steve kept to himself, but his eyes lingered too long on the drawer she used. Watched her close out, watched her count, watched her leave. Then one Tuesday night, while the rain returned outside, tapping against the windows like it had come back to finish what it started. The camera caught it. Steve waited until Susan left early to handle a delivery from the bakery supplier. The moment her truck pulled away from the curb, he moved. He opened her register with the master key, pulled out a stack of bills, 10s and 20s enough to notice, then replaced her count slip with one of his own, the numbers carefully altered in his neat handwriting. He even smiled, whispering to the empty diner, "Let's see you talk your way out of this." The camera caught it all. Every movement, every bill, every word. The next morning, Smith called a full staff meeting. Everyone gathered around the counter, confused. It was Thursday, not a usual meeting day. The cook wiped his hands on his apron. The waitresses exchanged nervous glances. Steve stood near the back, arms crossed, expression carefully neutral. The investigator placed a small laptop on the table and hit play. The footage rolled. The silence was brutal. Steve's hand reaching into the drawer. The money being pulled out. The count slip being replaced. And then, that night, after the dinner rush had settled into a comfortable hum, he stood up and called for everyone's attention. Conversations paused. Forks stopped mid-bite. "We built this place on compassion," he said, his voice carrying to every corner. "Susan reminded us what that means. Today I'm making it official. She's not just co-manager anymore. She's my partner." The staff broke into applause. The cook whistled. The waitresses hugged each other, tears in their eyes. Susan covered her face for a moment, overwhelmed, her shoulders shaking slightly. Smith walked over and handed her an envelope, thick, official, the kind that changed lives. "Legal papers confirming full partnership," he said quietly. "You've earned every bit of this." Her hands trembled as she took it. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything." Later, as the lights dimmed and the last customers left, Susan stepped outside for air. The night was cool, the kind that cleared the head and settled the heart. Across the street, under the neon glow of a car wash sign, a familiar figure scrubbed a windshield. Steve Harlow. His shoulders hunched, uniform damp from the mist, moving with the mechanical exhaustion of someone just trying to get through the shift. For a long moment, she just watched him. Then she walked across the street, calm and composed. He froze as she stopped beside him, his hand still on the sponge. Without a word, she handed him a sealed envelope. "What's this?" he asked, voice low, wary. "Your name's on it," she said. "Open it when you're ready." She turned and walked away, her footsteps steady on the wet pavement. When he finally tore it open, his hands shaking slightly, he found a small check made out to a local charity, and a donation receipt in his name. Under it, a handwritten note in careful script. Asterisk, "Everyone deserves a second chance. I had mine." Asterisk. Back at the diner, Susan flipped the sign from closed to open for the morning prep. The first light of dawn crept through the glass, reflecting off the polished counter. She tied her apron, her movements calm and sure, the weight of partnership sitting comfortably on her shoulders now. The first customer walked in, shaking off rain from his coat. Susan smiled softly. "Morning," she said. "Welcome to Rainy Day Diner, where kindness is always on the menu."